think people have not yet mentioned their names against, right? So, Tasneem has posted a list. Okay, but Tasneem, your voice is not very good. Voice quality of what
Sir,
you're
because of network, sir, I am helpless.
okay. You can put in the chat box if you have to say something.
Yeah, sure, sir. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So we start with Madhumita. All set.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I have a PPT to present, so if you could make me the presenter.
Okay. How do I make you present? Let me see. Wait a minute. It's Madhu 100 kV, right?
Yes, that's it. Madhu
I'm
100
making you.
kV.
Yeah. You can present now. Go ahead.
Can you see it now?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Why Comparative Indian Literature by Sisir Kumar Das. Um, he begins the essay with another question: why Indian literature? So we have many literatures in India, but why is there a need for an Indian literature? So a very simplistic answer would be that if we were the only one in the whole world, we'd probably not even need a name, or there won't be a need to define ourselves. But when there is another person and there are other eyes looking at us, at that time there comes a need to let them know what we more or less are. So our differences, because we are a multilingual and multicultural nation, are to a great extent conceivable to us and understandable to us. But to the ones who are out of the scene, or who are new to the scene or late on the scene, these are rather bewildering. So we need to define Indian literature so that if someone takes a text from Indian literature, say for example an Assamese text, how can they say that they had the experience of reading and in reading a text from Indian literature? So that is why we need Indian literature at all. Then he goes on to say that it's not actually the sum total of literatures written in India in the various languages, but it is the relations between them. It's a complex of literary relations. So we are striving for an engaging view of Indian literature as an essence instead of a, just an impersonal view of it as an archive. So the relations, literary relations, are what is very important here. How did comparative literature emerge? It emerged in the West, but it emerged more because one had to go out of the notion of the autonomy of national literatures. One had to understand that European literature was not the only literature, that there are other literatures that exist. Its ultimate goal is to visualize the total literary activities of man as a single universe. And universal poetics is something that Goethe also talks about, that we'll look at in one of the later slides. Goethe talks about Weltliteratur in German, and in English it is world literature. On the right hand side, I've shown this snippet from Eckermann's notes, conversations with Goethe. So he notes down a conversation he had with Goethe when Goethe was actually reading a Chinese novel. And then he's taken by surprise, actually, Eckermann. He asked Goethe, aren't Chinese novels indecent and vulgar? Why are you reading them? Goethe said, not at all. And that is when he says that Eckermann says maybe it's just a chance success and just one text in the Oriental literature that turned out to be a good book. That's when Goethe says that the Chinese have thousands of them and had already when our forefathers were still living in the woods. He goes on to say something like, national literature is now rather an unmeaning term. The epoch of world literature is at hand, and everyone must strive to hasten its approach. But while we thus value what is foreign, we must not bind ourselves to anything in particular and regard it as a model. So that is when, in 1827, January the 31st, the term or the concept world literature was first coined by Goethe. And what Shishir Kumar Das has to say is that what Goethe meant is not the sum total of all literatures, but some of the most memorable of works. Then Das talks about the comparatist. What are the aims of the comparatist? And are they in some way similar to what Goethe's aim was? Can we say that the comparatist has the same aims as that of Goethe when he spoke of world literature? And the answer is not exactly, because what the comparatist tries to do is he studies the relationships, the resemblances, and the differences between. Hello.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So I have mentioned here that comparative literature is boundless and cosmopolitan. These are two integral elements of premises of comparative literature, and we are going to talk about cosmopolitanism later on. Then Shishir Kumar Das goes on to talk about the Western comparatist. Comparative literature first emerged in the West, but why did they leave out Oriental literatures? Why did the scholars and the translators and the academicians in the West leave out the Eastern literatures when there was so much of interaction between the West and the East? I have shown here the picture of the cover of Jean de La Fontaine's Book of Fables. On the right hand side is Panchatantra. In one of his Book of Fables, in the preface, he says he is indebted to the one who compiled these Panchatantra fables. He calls him Pilpe, I don't know exactly. And on the right hand side, I've shown a map of Andalusia in Spain, which earlier was called Al-Andalus. And Cordoba in Al-Andalus was actually the center of Arabic literary studies. So Arabic and Persian and Sanskrit had found uh, their way to European literature far before uh, they are ready to acknowledge it. Then why is the Western comparatist not willing to talk about Oriental literature? And the answer Shishir Kumar Das gives is that it was not ignorance, because to plead ignorance of Eastern literature may be a euphemism for Macaulayan arrogance. Many of these European scholars and translators had actually access to Arabic, Persian, Chinese, Sanskrit, and Japanese literature. We can't accuse them of Eurocentrism. So it is definitely not ignorance or prejudice against the Eastern literatures. It is because of practical reasons. He says it is because they wanted to eschew any possible dilettantism or parochialism on their side. Because one of the basic premise of comparative literature is that you have to have a relation with the people or the culture of the literature that you are studying. So it can't be just an impersonal study of the literature. You have to have a strong relation with the culture and the people. And that was something that they could not boast of. So that might be the reason they hung up their spikes on this one, to avoid any historical parallel based solely on speculation. So they didn't want to just speculate and focus on only that which they know is strongly their forte. Now, if there is a comparative literature, why do we need a comparative Indian literature? So, in very simplistic terms, I have said that it was too ambitious a project for them to take care of us when they had themselves to look after. It's This is why we need a comparative literature here for Indian literatures, which will be just as valid as comparative literature in the West. And the principle, as I talked before, is the relation with that culture. Neither language nor political boundary nor culture can be the sole criterion. Because if language is a criterion, then we cannot bring British literature and American literature under the same umbrella, though they are connected by the same language. Political boundary is very fluid, as we talked, and it continuously changes, and that is very unreliable also. So it is relation with the culture and not just culture, because literature is born of language, but it goes beyond language. So is comparative Indian literature valid is the next question that he asks, and then he answers it, yes, because as Indians and as part of Indian culture, our comparative literature must be a comparative Indian literature, the way comparative literature of the West was a comparative Western literature. Our situs and relation with that culture is a terra firma for our literary studies. We need to learn the lesson of vigilance against dilettantism from the West. We cannot study literature as a body of impersonal knowledge without any relation to the people or to the time to which it belongs, which is something that we have now. We have because we are Indians. We are Indian scholars. And then in the end of the essay, he ends the essay with this line: Indian literature is not merely Indian. There is a question he asks: if we only study Indian literature, won't it lead to a kind of literary patriotism or critical parochialism? Yes, it will, because if we study only our literature, uh, being a multilingual nation, we should understand that a lot of foreign languages have had influence on our languages. Our languages have had influence on each other's and led to new literary styles. But foreign languages have had effect on our languages and led to new languages like Urdu. If you have to study about Konkani literature, then you need to have a knowledge about the Portuguese influence also. If you want to study about Indian tragedies, then you should go back and um, trace back to the ancient Greeks. So we need to have a thorough knowledge of even the foreign literatures, and have a wide literary perspective for our comparative Indian literature to be totally valid. And in the end, he says our journey is not from comparative literature to comparative Indian literature, but from comparative Indian literature to comparative literature. So we start from home, and then we um, uh, go to other areas. I think that's it. That's my presentation.
Right. Okay. Any questions, doubts, including the presenter? As about, I don't think it's very difficult text, but any clarification about, so why comparative literature, comparative Indian literature? What's the reason that you are studying this subject? And what is Sisir Kumar Das's reply to this? Anyone? So why does he say we need comparative Indian literature? So why have you opted for this paper? No, सन्नाटा क्यों हो गया क्लास? No one knows why study comparative Indian literature. Why are you studying this paper at all? Okay, what Priti is saying is to understand how Indian literature needs to be studied differently from than Western literature. Okay, but why do you want to study Indian literature at all in first place? What does Sisir Kumar say? Sisir Kumar Das say?
Sir, maybe to stay connected to our history and our culture.
Okay, to stay connected to our history and culture, right? But what is the reason that Sisir Kumar Das gives, which is even more fundamental than just kind of patriotic or nationalistic need for studying Indian literature, right? Yeah, Dehini.
So, sir, I don't know if this is the correct answer, but when like Madhu explained it very nicely that if only Indian literature was there, then there was no need to give a heading to it. But because there are different literatures present there, there is a need for you know for us to recognize it as something which also exists in the world, and it is comparable to others. It is kept in the same level as others, and continuously we learn about it. So that was one. The second one was that she said that it was about your first question that you asked, that others cannot protect us, others cannot lead our uh, literature or the culture that we have to present. We have to do it by ourselves.
Yeah, but even if you look at this, these are still nationalistic, patriotic answers, right? These are not very academic answers. And I don't think he wants to put it that way. As if हमारा ही literature होता तो is, I don't know where that question is. Can you point out, Madhu? Where does he say that because there are other literatures, we have to study our literature? Aisa? Where does he say that? Can you pinpoint number?
I can say why he says we should study comparative Indian literature. He says that because because as Indians we have a connection with the culture and the people here. So the way we understand the literature, with the relations between literature and the people, literature and the culture, the way that way probably somebody who is studying about Indian literature somewhere else, maybe across Asia, maybe in Europe, they don't have that we have, that
Mm,
relation between literature and culture and people, and that is very important when it comes to comparative literature. Not
okay.
just an impersonal study, but relating our study with cultures and people.
Okay. What Sisir Kumar does is to go even deeper than that. Right? He says that study of any literature, A, B, C, D, E, is to be primarily study of literature as it belongs to people, not just language. Which means that when you study Shakespeare, Shakespeare doesn't belong to language English only, but society to which Shakespeare belongs, right? That society which speaks English language, right? The group of people who share that language share Shakespeare. So Shakespeare belongs to people who speak English, right? Or if you want to say, so literature cannot be studied as belonging only to the language, but also to people. That is the fundamental reason, and that is the basic methodology that he states regarding study of any literature. You cannot study American literature as something that is just written in American English, right? But something that belongs to Americans. What is the difference between studying literature as belonging to language only and studying literature as belonging to people who speak that language? Is there any difference?
Yes, sir.
What is the difference, Dehin?
Sir, if we just study the language and the literature used in it, so I can also learn Japanese and write something in Japanese, right? But I am not a Japanese person, right? But if I am, and as it is already established, language carries its culture. So if you are a Japanese and you're writing something in that same language, you are also representing your culture. So by looking at that perspective, you are looking at a very broader domain and a very interesting one, which associates language and culture beautifully.
Right. And you know what? Our English study is at least, we study Milton as if he belongs to English language only. We don't take into account the fact that he belongs in the sense of belonging to a group, right? Of people who speak English, right? Praja, right? He is part of that people. So literature has to be studied not just as, so Milton's poem is not just a poem in English. I hope you get what I'm saying. It belongs to, in that sense, not just language, but to the people. It tells us what people are talking about themselves through English. That poem. Poem is a property of the people who speak English. Right. So how will that way of studying differ? You study whatever English literature that you study as English literature belonging to that language, right? But Sisir Kumar Das says that literature does not belong only to language, but to people. If you bring in this shift in your methodology of studying, how will you study Milton then? What, how will it be different from studying English and studying Milton as belonging to English? Is my question clear? Studying studying Milton as belonging to English language and studying Milton as belonging to people who speak English. What would be the difference in the way you study. First of all, will there be a difference? And if yes, what? Komal, Khadija, Sezal, how will it be different? Pooja, Naiya, Merlin, बताओ. Rushi. Harita, Ananya, Hiren.
So maybe so the difference, I cannot exactly pinpoint the difference between the two, but what I can say is that when we read Milton, or when we when we learn about Milton, we learn it as the fact that he was a Puritan, and we see those things in his texts. We see the love for religion and the love for and how he has kept it above all. Uh, and the greatest example is nothing other than Paradise Lost. So when we associate Milton with the people, the culture back then we can understand him in a different way. But if you would just look at Milton from the language perspective, then it will be maybe a little bit more a structuralist way of looking at it, uh, but not a historicist way.
Very good. So you will be looking for formal properties as if they are abstract of people, right? So people के साथ उसका कुछ लेना देना है ही नहीं मिल्टन का. But if you see that Milton is part of that people who speak English, right? And in those days, people who spoke English were largely limited to Britain in Milton's time or in Shakespeare's time. So you are studying it as giving you information or knowledge also about those people, right? Yes, no. Increasing knowledge about the people who speak English, right? And what kind of information would that give you? What kind of knowledge would that result in? Anyone? Right, in some way, yes. What Preeti is saying is that it would, instead of just looking at how he is, his art of writing, you're also taking into account his cultural and national identity, okay? And as Dehini was saying about the fact that particular denomination to which he belongs, his religious beliefs, okay? So now you start looking at him as a representative text of the people, giving you knowledge about those people at that point of history, right? 17th century. So Milton is not read just as a craftsman or a writer who writes an epic, but and even the form of epic has something to do with people, right? Epics usually talk about subjects which are very important to people. So reading Paradise Lost would be giving us information about what is important for people who speak that language, right? It tells us about their values, right? Their problems, right? So focus shifts away from merely formal properties of the text to what it reveals about the people and their lives, what is important to them, right? So what is important to them if you read Paradise Lost? What are the questions? इसके बारे में लिखता है, but then even that is not very true because he's writing about God, right? But he is talking to a certain set of people who speak that language. So you have to go beyond what he writes about to who he writes for and how does that matter to those people. So how does Paradise Lost matter to those people? It becomes the question rather than asking how well written is the English text or how what kind of English was Milton writing? How well did he write in English? That does not become the central question. The central question is what is he talking about and why is that important for the people to which he belongs? So if you explain Paradise Lost in that way, what will happen? Why does Paradise Lost matter to English people? Does it matter at all?
Yes, sir, it does, and I think one of the reasons is because it is the last epic ever written. Because of that, and also as it talks about the whole Eve and like the heaven and everything. So maybe because of that.
I didn't get it very clearly. Can you just repeat? Because your voice was.
I think the major reason is because it's the last written in English literature. Maybe
Last
that's one reason
I
that
thought
it
it
is.
was the
Is
first
that the
one.
last?
It's the first one. No?
Oh no, sorry. Yeah. Oh right. So sorry. I'm correct. No.
Why did it matter to English people? Unmute yourself, Suhan. Preeti says it matters because it reinforces people's belief. Now, why do you need to reinforce people's belief? What's the reason? Acha, his niece is shocked. That's what matters to Suhan just now. She had enough of Paradise Lost. So why does it matter that you have to reinforce people's belief? Why do you need to reinforce people's belief in first place? To justify ways of God to men, right? Of man's first disobedience and the fruit. Why does that matter?
it matters because when there is a lot of chaos and when some people feel that there is a need for people to know about morality once again and to be, in terms of morality, the actual human. And because
Only
of
morality. Is it only morality or a specific kind of morals?
no, it's mainly associated with religious morality. Right? Because it's at the end of the day, it's always religion. So I think the age before that, when Elizabeth died and there was a transition, and I don't remember Jacobean, I don't remember, and there was a lot of loss of churches and everything. And then Puritans rose to power, Oliver Cromwell came and Milton beside them. And it was all a surge, it was a rise towards religion because there was a loss of it in the previous age. That is
Exactly.
why there was.
So there is a crisis before people that the faith that these people had been holding on to for centuries is now suddenly shaken because of new kind of developments. And as you say, chaos seems to have set in, right? And people, when people's faith is now being shaken, right? You need to reinforce it. Justify ways of God to men when people start questioning God's ways, right? It's only then you have to say that you have to justify ways of God to men. When men start questioning whether these are his ways at all or not, right? So there he's responding to certain social crisis, right? And a social crisis is fairly complex, and to understand that complex crisis, we need to look into the history of that society, right? So we need to take on board something like Renaissance and the rise of new bourgeoisie, the new middle class, uh, which is more anthropocentric rather than theocentric, which is more pragmatic, which is more self-centered, right? As can be seen in Machiavelli's Prince or whatever. So it's not theocentric world any longer that you want to bring about to reinforce a theocentric worldview. I hope you get what I'm trying to say. So it is not a crisis uh, for Milton's personal problem, but it's crisis for the society that Milton is articulating. And that's why Milton matters to the society, because he gives voice to this problem, right? So you stop looking at literature also from a very individualistic perspective. You stop looking at literature from very formalistic perspective. Now you see literature as an expression of a group of people and their problems, right? Problems that matter to that group of people. Why I'm having this extended conversation is because this approach to the study of literature is, when you shift it to Indian context, that justifies comparative literature. Why we need to do that in the first place, right? And that would also justify, means even if you want to study Paradise Lost, then you have to take a comparative view for to make sense of what's happening. And very selection of genre of epic, which was a kind of marker of status in the classical period, right? It was seen as an expression of ethos. What Homer is saying is voicing something about the Greek society. He's articulating the problems and the challenges and the issues faced by Greek society. And that's why Homer is so important for the Greeks, that they keep on singing him for thousands of years. Mahabharata articulates certain problems here, which are so important to us that we keep on producing versions and versions of it, whether it's Ramayana or the Mahabharata. I hope you get. So selection of epic as a genre itself suggests that he wants to be a spokesperson for his community. He wants to be what Homer was for the Greeks, what Virgil was for the Romans, right? So he wants to be that for the English society. That's why he chose to write it in vernacular, like Dante did. Dante wrote Inferno and Paradiso in the vernacular Latin called Italian, right? Desi Bhasha. So, is that clear what he means by what is literature in the first place? Literature is property not of language but of people. Now, if a German person wants to study literature, what literature will he study as a German person? What literature will a German study as a German person? Because literature is a property of people. So what literature will a German person study, or a Japanese person or a Chinese person will study?
Their own literature,
And why?
because as Das said that you should start with your home literature, so that is like,
Start with your home.
yeah. Because that is the most accessible to them.
Yeah, accessibility, yes, but something more, I think, intense than just accessibility. In fact, it's not accessible to you, many of you.
So intimacy with their own culture,
Pardon?
intimacy with their own culture,
But why? Why?
because that's how they have born and brought up.
Okay. You are born and brought up in that way. That's why you have to study your own culture. Something more than that.
Sir, again, the same point, to stay connected with their own history and to know what has been written in their own language
But
before.
why? Sir, क्यों? क्यों मगर? Why should you study literature and things written in your language? उसकी क्या जरूरत है?
I don't know why का भी आंसर मुझे तो यही आ.
जो इसने दिया है, शिशिर कुमार दास.
Okay.
Anyone wants to try? So one says maybe the literature which matter to their present condition. Okay. Whose present condition? Sohan. Okay. So Khadija, what is the language that you speak at home?
Wagdi, it's a mix, like a dialect of Rajasthani.
Right. So how will you then? It's all about who you are then.
Yes, sir.
So who are you?
I don't know. Actually, the answer is so complex because I'm so many things at once and nothing at once. Like, I don't know.
No, that is very philosophical answer. But if you ask, somebody asks you, who are you?
I am normally I am a girl and I am from like I belong to a Muslim family. That's what I say.
Right. So,
Yes.
so if you belong to particular gender and religion, you
Yes.
also belong to particular community which is formed of those people,
Yes.
right?
Yes. Yes, sir.
Same gender and same religion.
Yes, sir.
Yes, no.
Yes. Yes.
And if you belong to that community, then does that community matters to you?
Not much to me, but yes, like it does to people. It does.
Huh. Huh. I think now we are actually able to isolate our problems in study of literature, right? Milton's audience read Milton because he is talking about something that matters to his readers,
Matters. Yeah, right.
right? They are not reading him because he is prescribed in the syllabus.
Yeah, right.
जबरदस्ती से एग्जाम के लिए पढ़वा रहे इसलिए नहीं पढ़ रहे थे वो लोग.
Like it's all about connecting to what or relating to what he.
What matters to the people. So what matters, say for example, to your gender or to your religion, matters to you as as a person. Can you say that?
To some extent, but not much.
To what extent?
I don't know. Like I have not read much of my own like
Because it
religion.
did not matter to you, right?
Yeah, it doesn't matter much.
Right. But you know what? What your gender and religion has to face, uh, because your religion and gender matters to others.
Yes, sir.
So you
But
will
actually,
face
there is another problem. Like what
so
we have to
even if
live
it
with.
doesn't matter to you, it will.
But sir, the problem is that most of the things that we read on a regular basis, like in our community, it is written in Arabic, so we don't even understand it. Now that's another confusion that we know how to read it, but we can't speak it.
So that is why literature is not property of a language, but of people. So that is not your literature technically, because nobody understands what they are reading. They are reading it
But then why are
because
we
it's a
even?
ritual which has to be done,
Yes, exactly.
right? So,
Yes,
but
sir.
then you have to figure out what is it that matters to you as a person of particular religion and particular gender.
Okay, that's complex. I don't know.
Good. So this is the place where you start off your self-discovery, right?
Yes, sir.
A German doesn't have these questions because what matters to German society matters to that person, and that's why he studies what German literature is. That person has stakes in German literature because he is part of that group that speaks German language, right? So it's obvious that German should study German literature. In your case, what has happened is that you don't see any stake there, but that doesn't mean other people don't have stake in you, in your religion and your gender.
Yes, sir. It would take some time to.
आंख बंद कर देने से कुछ होने वाला है नहीं. ट्रेन तो सामने से आने वाली है, वो गायब नहीं होगी. Right, so.
पर सर मैं ट्रेन के रास्ते में ही नहीं खड़ी रहूंगी, भाग जाऊंगी.
ऐसा आपको लगता है? सोचो थोड़ा, कहाँ पे खड़ी हो? So I think you need to figure out where you are standing.
Yes, sir. It would take some
I
time,
can
but
see train headed towards you. You can't see it, but it's there, right? So you don't feel that there are stakes in your gender or religion or your language or whatever,
yes,
or community, but it is part of a larger community which has stakes in it.
yes, sir.
Okay. So one of the basic reasons that you study literature in the first place, according to Sisir Kumar Das, is because literature is part of the group which speaks that language, right? Dryden talks about Shakespeare not because Shakespeare is prescribed in his syllabus. है ना? Samuel Johnson feels Shakespeare is very important to him because not because he's prescribed in his syllabus and he has to pass that exam so that he will get the degree. Does it make any sense what I'm saying? क्योंकि जॉनसन और ड्राइडन के टाइम पे इंग्लिश लिटरेचर कॉलेज में पढ़ाया ही नहीं जाता था. Only classical literature was taught. So why should Dryden write about Shakespeare and translate his plays into heroic couplets? I don't know if you have studied this part of English literary history. How many of you know about the fact that Dryden translated some of Shakespeare's plays into contemporary form? The next let me question ask that. How many of you know? He wrote a play called Antony and Cleopatra, right? Does anyone know this? Okay. In heroic couplets. Why should he be bothered to do that? And Alexander Pope translated Iliad. Does anyone know that? Into heroic couplets. ये भी next set में आ सकता है. So the reason why you don't know these things is because you have been taught that literature is a property of language, right? And that is why you selected English in the first place in BA and your MA program. That you thought that literature कहाँ पे रहता है? Language में रहता है, right? That is how you were taught to study literature. You were never taught to study literature as something which belongs to the group of people and articulate whatever matters to that group, right? So the methodology that is followed in our colleges is as if literature सिर्फ language में रहता है, पर वो language बोलने वालों के बीच रहता है. Anyone has to say something? And it is not because of nationalistic reasons that you are studying literature in your language, right? It's because the issues and the debates that are there in that literature are the things that matter to you as a human being, as a person, as a group. That is what I'm saying. What do you have to say about this? So Sisir Kumar Das is actually saying that patriotism or nationalism cannot be the basis, but it requires a terra firma, right? On page 100. Whatever the goal of comparative literature, it must be have a terra firma, a solid ground. Indian literatures produced in Indian languages like Hindi or Tamil or Marathi or Assamese alone can provide that solid ground to start with. So also consider the fact that if you feel this subtractive bilingualism thing that we have been talking about also cuts you off from your community, you feel that you no longer belong to that community. Your community always thinks that you belong to them, right? So it creates an illusion that you are living in some sort of domain in which there is no society. Yeah, that's kind of illusion it creates. But once you want to get married or get a job or step out of your home, you will find that you cannot step outside of the society.
Yes, sir. Especially when you have to write your religion or community on the forms, you will have to write specifically from which community you belong. So yeah, to some extent, it's true.
Right? That's the train that is coming. Right? So study of English literature cuts you off and makes you live in a kind of illusionary world, which is so westernized that you think these things like caste or religion or gender or ये सब चीजें कोई काम की है ही नहीं. Let's study American literature, जहाँ पे ये सब नहीं होता. Right? But moment you start moving further from where you are, that illusion is very often broken, and you realize the real issues that are staring at you in your face, and you can't reconcile your study of literature with the society that you are living in. ऐसा होता है? How many of you have experienced that? That study of literature goes on in one domain, and the moment you disconnect from that domain, you enter entirely another domain which has no connection with what is going on in the class. Life और study के बीच में एक बहुत बड़ा gap हो जाता है. How many of you have experienced this?
I think this happens when we read feminist theories and discuss about it in classes, and then after the class we actually have to deal with reality where where you actually have
Rubber
to
meets the road, as they say, right?
yeah.
Right. So you realize, array, this is patriarchy, this is caste, this is gender, this is all the things.
Yes, I feel like it's easy to talk about it and write about it and like have discussions on it, but when you are hit with reality, you'll see that it's happening and it has been there and it has been happening in front of your eyes, but you can't do much to change it. That's when it strikes that, oh no, I mean, I can write about it and talk about it, but I can't like fight with it alone. And at that time, you feel like you don't have any choice apart from just letting it happen.
Right. So your predicament is that of helplessness, right, Khadija? That you don't realize that that real predicament that you can't do much to alter the tracks of that train which is coming.
Yes,
That
yes,
results in certain kind of helplessness. And
yes,
if someone articulates that helplessness in literature, will that matter to you?
yes, sir. That will.
Right. So that is the reason why you study literature.
Yes, like there are certain genre or certain studies that we like to study more than the others, like be it feminism or about patriarchy or sexism, racism. So I would enjoy reading those more than the other. So I mean that matters.
Right. So a Japanese will study Japanese literature because Japanese literature articulates these issues which matter to that person. Right. So that becomes the terra firma of. So Japanese, before that person starts reading Gujarati literature, the way you study English literature, which is removed from everyday life, that person is already aware of the literature which deals with those issues that he faces or she faces every day. Right? So that person's decision to study Gujarati literature is to broaden his or her perspective on understanding of his own literature. I hope you get what I'm saying. That person does not study English literature in order to run away from social realities that he is facing, but broaden understanding of his own realities. Right? And that is why study of Indian literature and Sisir Kumar Das argues, by default cannot be parochial. By default, because of historical reasons. And he says Indian literature is not only Indian, right? It has interacted with several civilizations. Chinese with various kinds of Islamic civilizations, with Chinese civilization, with the Western civilization through British colonialism, with Western civilization through new media. So Indian civilization has interacted with other civilization for thousands of years, which make it difficult to be parochial. Right? I hope you get what I'm saying. You cannot be parochial. Because let me give you an example. For me to understand Premchand, I have to understand Chekhov, because Chekhov is one of the important influences and on Premchand, maybe along with Tolstoy, right? Along with American short story writers. So realism in Premchand comes from certain places. At the same time, certain humanist vision, certain influence of Marxist socialism that Premchand carries, certain influence of Gandhian thought can be discerned in the works of Premchand. So I cannot study Premchand without studying Marxist socialism, without studying Gandhianism, without studying Chekhov, without studying Tolstoy. I hope you get what I'm saying. So to understand Premchand, I have to move out of Hindi circuit, Hindi domain. I have to move into Gandhian thought. I have to move into Marxism and Russian Revolution, about which he must have read somewhere, right, in 1917. And then I have also to read up on Chekhov and Tolstoy and Gorky and others who are very popular in his time. So I have to move outside Hindi to understand Hindi writer. Right? To understand Kabir, I have to understand the Nath tradition. I have to understand the Sufi traditions. I have to understand the Siddha traditions. I have to understand Islam. I have to understand Upanishads. So I cannot limit myself to certain language only if I have to make sense of what Kabir is saying. These two examples can serve, I think, can illustrate what Sisir Kumar Das is saying. And yes, I cannot understand Premchand without understand Farsi literature, because he was an important writer in Urdu. And he wrote substantially in Urdu. And because he thought there are more readers in Hindi, he moved away from Urdu and started writing in Hindi. Right? So I have to understand why a single language called Hindustani was bifurcated into Urdu and Hindi. And sociolinguistics says that this is diglossia or diglossia. Means one language is spoken in or written in two forms. एक ही language के दो स्वरूप है. एक को उर्दू कहते हैं और एक को हिंदी कहते हैं. But primarily it is Hindustani or Hindavi as it was called in earlier times. And then Khadi Boli becomes the chief standard Hindi. Khadi Boli is a dialect of a particular place. So I have to understand all these things if I have to understand Premchand, who is a major Urdu writer as well. And the fact that Urdu was caricatured to be the language of Muslims when it was language of many people who are not Muslims. Right? For example, Firaq Gorakhpuri or Gulzar or Premchand himself are major Urdu writers who are not Muslims. Right? So I have to understand all these multilingualities in order to understand a Hindi writer. I hope you get what I'm saying. But I have to start with Hindi writer. That is my terra firma, that is my solid ground, and then move outwards. So I have to go away from comparative. Our journey is not from comparative literature to comparative Indian literature, but comparative Indian literature to comparative literature. Because the Western models cannot be simply adopted. Yes. So what are thoughts in your mind? Quickly. There are some portions of the essay that we need to discuss. We'll do that tomorrow. But on the basis of this much discussion, what is it that comes to your mind? What are you taking away? What have you learned today? What is your thought? Hiren, Ananya, Dehini, Sezel, Pooja, Merlin, Naya, Sohan, Sam, बताओ, Devya. What is coming to your minds?
बस सर एक ही चीज आ रही है कि ये बात सही है।
Pardon?
सही बात है।
Just come again. I couldn't get.
No sir, when you discussed everything, the one thing that came to my mind is like, यार ये सही बात है। That's it.
Right. So when you are studying, pardon? Yeah, go ahead, Ananya.
And nothing, the way it's nothing. You continue.
So I think it means the multiple possibilities turn in experience where we interpret within the languages which is being promoted in public sphere, and this is how we automatically see ourselves as a literature student.
Right. So you are not a literature student who has a cultural and social life. You are a person with a social and cultural life who is studying literature. I hope you get that. And literature articulates or participates in this social and cultural life of the people. What Kabir is saying matters even today for people. That's why Kabir is alive. Mahabharata is alive. Right? Ghalib is still alive because what he says matters to us. So it's a process of self-discovery that comparative Indian literature undertakes. Yes, Pooja, you look at who you are, right? as a social and cultural being, and then your study of literature is because those things that matter to you are being discussed in literature. Gives voice, not always solutions, but voice that things that matter. Right. Anything else? We have become very short-sighted that we are not really students of literature. We are so short-sighted, and that is not actually our fault. It has something to do with our education system, right? Which wants us to be short-sighted. It really does not want you to look at what matters to the society to which you belong. It doesn't want you to look at these things. That's why you could not see these things, right? And Pooja.
No, sir, I was just agreeing to what you were saying because even I was thinking same, ki like there's a thin line between as a
Yeah, and because we are so short-sighted कि एग्जाम के लिए सिलेबस में टेक्स्ट है वो पढ़ देने की, और बाद में क्या एग्जाम पास हो जाने के बाद मेरे को मिल्टन के साथ क्या लेना देना है वैसे भी, है ना?
yeah, it's like we are unconsciously consuming everything.
Right.
And
Questioning
not,
it or trying to understand it.
yeah, we are like not aware of everything around us.
Right. And to understand something, you have to question it. Why are we doing it in the first place, right?
Right.
So when you study Milton or when you study Shakespeare, it doesn't matter to you. इसलिए रट्टा लगाना पड़ता है. Because it's not part of our problems. Our problem is to clear the exams and get certain reputation job because of the degree. So we are pseudo students, and when I say we, it also implies me, right? We are not students of literature, but pseudo students. Agree or disagree?
Sir, I think our interest to acknowledge us, which turns into the question that why you want to know rather than the how I want to know.
मैं तो आपसे पूछ रही हूँ कि मैं हूँ कौन? Yeah, you're asking me who you are, right? You have to find that out for yourself.
Sir, अपने आप से.
Nobody can tell you who you are, and if somebody tells you who you are, then you are in trouble. That person has an ulterior agenda. Okay. अपने आप. Okay, so we stop for today, and tomorrow we will continue. If you have more questions, I will continue a couple of points that are raised here, and then we will have presentation on the next essay, right? But this is about the why comparative Indian literature. So to answer that, he says, why study literature at all? That is fundamental question. That answer will tell you why you study Indian literature. And that will tell you why you have to study comparative literature, comparative Indian literature. I hope you get it. Literature क्या है ये जानने के बाद इंडियन लिटरेचर क्या है और कंपैरेटिव लिटरेचर क्यों पढ़ना है, लिटरेचर क्यों पढ़ना है, ये सबके आंसर्स मिल जाए. Right? So that is how he's building his argument. Okay. So we'll meet tomorrow then.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Thank
So
you.
have a good day and see you tomorrow.